Welcome to the Smell Like Jesus podcast. I'm Jonathan Schrader from Reservoir Church, and this is a podcast for members of Reservoir and our friends near and far that will help you, hopefully, think through things Christianly. And today we're going to be talking about Christian masculinity. Now, it's a conversation that comes up in the church all the time. How do men live as Christians in the midst of our world? And especially young men now, when there is a predominance of influencers, podcasters that are presenting this prevailing view of masculinity that is quite in opposition to Christianity, in the opinion of myself and so many others. They might mix in some ideas of faith and kind of present it as a Christian ideal for men, and it becomes appealing, but it is not what we see in the biblical account of how we are supposed to live or how we are to look like Christ. So I've invited on a couple friends that are a pastor and a Christian creative across the globe to discuss Christian masculinity, a definition, and then how do we disciple specifically young men, but then men in our church. And I think there's something for everybody here, not just the men, but even women in our lives, as they think through how can we encourage each other to pursue Jesus together, all that we may smell like Jesus. So I'm very thankful to have with us John Reese, who is a senior pastor of a mega church in
Yeah.
Washington, Iowa.
Mhm.
For the context, probably mega in spirituality and fruitfulness, without a doubt. And then also somebody who you can't see for different reasons, but Matt Pilgrim, who is a Christian creative from across the globe. And he is one of my favorite poets, dear friend, who has been on the Smell Like Jesus podcast before, talking about creativity. And so today we're talking about Christian masculinity. And so this is going to be predominantly a middle-aged white guy perspective. And so I'm going to bring as much of the urban aspect as we can, because I may be the most urban of all of us. So we'll just have to deal with that. But
I
I
got
do want to
rural.
talk. You got the rural. That's
I
right.
got rural.
You've got the Iowa
Yep.
frame in mind. But what started this desire to have this conversation as the California sun comes out? It was probably a month or two ago. Well, actually, it goes back to really the murder of Charlie Kirk. And following that, I offered to um, watch, a series of shows of some people in my church, the Charlie Kirk show, and just like process Christianly through the material of those shows and like, how do we weigh what influencers are bringing to the table? And that from those conversations, which nobody actually took me up on that offer, they just wanted to maintain their own perspectives. But from that put me down this rabbit hole of evaluating influencers and podcasters that were out there, especially those that were likely to be listened to by people in our church and young men that were in our church or adjacent to our church, so children of people in our church. And so, it was along the lines of, so Charlie Kirk was among them, but like Nick Fuentes and, Ben Shapiro, a lot in the political sphere, but then also with Joe Rogan and others that really represented, like, what does it mean to be a man? And so have been having lots of conversations with our elders and with others, pastors in the area, and just like, what does it mean? And this is the constant, interaction in Christianity. What does it mean to be a Christian man? And so I thought it would be good to continue the conversation by having some of my best theological minds in my life on, just to interact and see where we can get on both defining Christian masculinity and then also thinking through how do we disciple the next generation of young men, those coming up in Gen Z and soon in Gen Alpha. And so here we are. Now, John Reese, you are a father who is successful in fatherhood. You have children that are grown. You only have one left in the house that is in high school. And so you've married, you're actually a grandfather now. So you don't look it. You're super young.
So great. It's so great.
And then Matt Pilgrim, you have young children, young boys in the home that are still in primary school. And so you've got the younger end of the spectrum. Then I've got a 13-year-old boy right in middle school. And so kind of bringing all of the perspectives together as we raise our sons. But let's start by just talking about defining Christian masculinity. And have you guys come across a definition that you feel like is appropriate, applicable, that we can use to kind of frame where we go from thinking through discipleship?
I don't know if I have necessarily a definition. I've been trying to cull some different things together, and there was actually a recent article in the Dispatch um, that was titled "The World Needs Magnanimous Men," and um, magnanimity is not a word that we use a whole lot, and it tends to. I mean, just hearing the word makes you think big and boisterous, but it's actually the opposite. And it centers on this idea of humility, of justice, of courage, resolve. Um, I wrote some of these things down that are generous, charitable. When you can exercise power to crush, you don't.
Hmm.
Um, and rising above petty feelings like resentment or vengeance. It's free from selfishness. I was attracted to this article, and then as I thought about your question with this regarding um, biblical or masculinity within the Christian sphere, it was like this just seems to hit really well. These ideas: humility, decency, courage, strength that is used for right purposes versus the ability or just to crush people. Um, so I was helped by that article, and I think that helped to bubble up some of the ideas that we even see in the life of Jesus, and with his meekness and strength and gentleness and courage. So that was some things that I kind of
Mm,
drew in.
yeah. Okay. So it is kind of a masculinity of restraint. Like you have power, but you don't use it to the full extent of it,
Yep.
which we're going to get to how that is absolutely cross-cultural and against what the prevailing kind of voice of influencers is that our young men are receiving. Matt, have you come across a definition that you think is helpful?
Uh, no, no, not necessarily. I guess to answer the question honestly, but I think when I was reflecting on the concept, um, it might be essentially an extension or an evolution or something of the idea of restraint. But um, my thoughts were kind of coming around this idea of taming, of essentially taming of all of the extremes for which we were created, but which have been corrupted.
Hmm.
Um, and and I think you could probably come up with a list of 20, but you could also probably come up with a list of three or four. But I mean, something like power or lust or something kind of falling under these categories of like um, these sort of not necessarily gentle or simple things for which we were created, but the sort of entering into them, fully experiencing them within uh like the beauty of what they were created for by God. So which I do think essentially requires restraint and humility and selflessness and a lot of, what you could probably list as the fruits of the spirit, or something along those lines. But the kind of the masculine journey being one of entering into, in some ways, like the darkness of what is there in all of us, and emerging with the light.
So I came across a definition from Eric Mason in his recent book, Rebranding the Church. And he had previously written a book on manhood that I think was received by a lot of people in the reform spaces. And it's a little longer quote, but he says, when asked, what is a man? People come up with various definitions, some conflicting, some evolving, some toxic, and others traditional or patriarchal. And some people may snarl at the idea of biblical manhood or womanhood. However, in this fleeting culture that seeks to define what God has already given clear meaning to, we must be clear as believers, and not just about gender, but also about roles and function. And then he cites another ministry, and he says that they give a biblically clear, encapsulating definition of manhood that is this: that men should accept responsibility, reject passivity, lead courageously, and invest eternally. And then he goes on saying, for us as believers, our wiring and personality types, real or perceived, don't exempt us as men from the biblical responsibilities God requires of all his people. And so that's the like more productive definition of the biblical masculinity, where the other side we see is more the restraint against what's been corrupted of the beauty of the image bearing things that we have from power, authority, strength, right? That we restrain it. But how much of those things that we've said, and even John, you brought up, that these are markers of that are exemplified in Christ, right? We will all agree that Jesus is the picture of Christian masculinity. But how much of that matches with the prevailing voice of what young men hear? I mean, John, did you talk to your sons of, the Andrew Tates of the world or others that are not about restraint, but more about conquest, about look maxing, about going out and being the best you can, and actually beyond all bounds, like attempting to achieve everything you can on your own, without regard to anyone else?
Yeah, I remember this was a completely different context or different topic, but I remember a number of years ago running across something as it related to alcohol, and the person who was talking about that with their kids or in a family context simply said, "Watch me." And I think that's been, I mean, there have been clear conversations with my boys about some areas of this. One of my boys is just tuned out to some of these sorts of things. But I think a lot of the work that I've done, I would say work that I've done with my kids has been that mentality of watch. What does it look like to be a godly man who isn't extremes? I thought it was helpful what Matt said about you can fall off on either side of extremes into error, and to say what does it look like to kind of chart a middle path that is strong and sensitive. And so sometimes verbally, sometimes not, more, watch me is been something I think that's been helpful for our family. And whether my, there's a variety of personality types with my boys in particular. And so I've had to have a little bit more frank conversations. The other has been a little bit more passive conversations on these things, but I think that's been a mark that I've tried to utilize with them is to say, watch how your mom and I interact. Watch how I talk to your mom. Watch how I speak about your mom around others. And that's just obviously one area, but I think that can cause, when the screaming voices are coming from the outside at them and might be appealing, they can go, but that's not what I heard at home. That's not what it looked like at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what I've tried to do to influence and to help my boys in that way.
Yeah, and I think that's really good. And kind of two things that follow from that. First being, who modeled that for you?
Mm-hmm.
And Matt, maybe you can answer that question too. Did you feel like you were prepared coming into manhood, or even kind of an awakening of Christianity in adulthood, that you had an awareness of these things, of the taming of the extremes, of what it meant to be a husband and father? And just to share for me, so my father, very loving, grew up in a Christian home. Clearly my mother had always been kind of the spiritual leader in our home. And actually this last year, in 2025, had a very interesting conversation. My dad called me kind of out of the blue and wanted to apologize to me for having not been as present as a father in my youth as he could have been. And I guess he did that with my other two brothers as well. And he was just thankful to the Lord that the three of us had become such good fathers, so present in our children's lives and caring for them, even in the absence of his um, active involvement in our lives in that way. And the thing was, he's always around in our lives, but it was he was, as he would tell it, he was interested in what was going on in his life, not necessarily what was going on in ours. And so that I was often looking. I think he loved my wife, or loved his wife and my mom, and cared for the family, provided as best he could. So there was examples there of faithfulness and continuity. But I was often looking, okay, well, what does it mean to lead in these contexts? What does it look like to be that Christian man from other places? So were there people for you guys that you were able to watch?
Yeah, I think part of my own maturing process, which is arguably, ongoing, like the part of the reflection is I guess having the grace with which you can look back and sort of acknowledge where there was like models and conversations and things provided, and then seeing like where there weren't those, but starting to have the empathy and, yeah, the perspective to say, yeah, I understand why. Like, I can see how family cultures and generational differences and different things impacted where some of the holes are and where some of the strengths are. And I think I see that, with both of my parents, and even, grandparents as well. Kind of, if you start really looking back, like, where have some of these things in who I am, and how I would tend to maybe be weak, or how I might tend to be strong, and kind of tracking the lineage of some of that, and asking like, okay, where did this come from? And then, I mean, once you can have some of that honesty going on, then you can start to say like, well, where do I need to work? Perhaps more here than somewhere else. And I think maybe, I don't know, part of that is looking at the current conversation voices and probably interrogating a little bit, like, what is this tapping into? There's a truth probably in some of this. I don't really engage with a lot of the names you're mentioning, but like, they're tapping into something true about men, right? Like, they're touching a chord. And that's an important reflection, I think, to say like, what are they saying that's touching on truth? And then where are we maybe going wrong, and where do conversations need to happen that kind of challenge or question, like, yeah, you were actually right for, I don't know, half the journey here, and then you you went too far, or maybe you didn't go far enough. Um, and I don't know. Those are very nuanced conversations. My kids are not quite to the age where we're having those, but certainly, certainly trying to set a different path and a different culture, like at home, so we can at least have something to play off what they see out in the world and discuss it at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and then so the other thing is too, it follows that we have models, and hopefully we are discipling other men in our church to provide that model as well. And because it's not just Gen Z that's hearing these things, it's other guys that have even grown up in kind of this muscular Christianity era, and all our men's group things are, monster trucks and grilling meat, which our men's ministry, all we do is grill meat and stuff. I tried to get us to call our men's ministry the Bride of Christ. But that didn't sell. So there's a lot of work in like providing examples, and I don't want men to be discouraged if they don't think that they're providing a great example, because I think there is something in the desire and the attempt, right? And there is that may be even more important than being perfect for your children to see, for your especially young men. And Eric Schumacher, another Iowan, just wrote an article in Common Good magazine. He was talking about vulnerability, and this is one of the things that I think every dad can learn along the way. As Matt, you were talking about, like, our road to maturity is not done. We are far from completion, right? We trust the Lord's going to bring us to completion when he returns, but we have a long way to go. And in this article, Eric says, for David, proclaiming God's splendor to the children who followed him required startling emotional vulnerability and transparent confession. He composed poems about his weaknesses, describing how his body would quake in terror as he bawled his eyes out in Psalm 6, right? He confessed doubting that the Lord remembered him in Psalm 13, and wondered aloud if he had been abandoned in Psalm 22 and 42. And he spoke openly about his sin in Psalms 32, 38, 51. And in his transparency, David opened up himself to mockery and derision, but there was no way of displaying the Lord's greatness to the next generation apart from confessing his own lack of greatness. And he goes on to compare, where Paul says that he's going to boast only in the cross and his weakness, and that you can't have one without the other. And that for us, it is, let's confess our sins and let our children hear that and see that, and let them know that we are weak and we are relying on the strength of Christ to be the man that he has called us to be. And we still have a long way to go, rather than this perfect packaged of, like, look how great I am, in competition with what else is out there. So from that, how do we get vulnerability, taming extremes, restraint, all these things, which, dare I label it, Christ-likeness? How do we get that to be appealing to men in our church, to young men in our church, to the next generation? Over and against the podcasts that they're listening to for hours a day.
Mhm.
How do we get them to be vulnerable? Is that some of the question?
Or start listening to the value of vulnerability versus machismo or the prevailing culture. How do we get them to meet the real Jesus so they can see him as the model of Christian masculinity versus everything else they hear? It's like there was one guy that it just incensed me, and I wish I had saved his name or whatever, but he was talking, it was on Instagram, some reel, and he was saying like Christian men need to step up. We should all own a gun. We should all care for our wives, some good things, right? We should do all these things, and we have to reject the craziness that is this idea that we're supposed to love our enemies, right? And at that, I'm like, what? Right? I mean, this is Sermon on the Mount stuff. This is Jesus telling us what it is to live in the kingdom. That it's like, dude, have you opened your Bible? And my concern is, and this is why we call the podcast Smell Like Jesus, and now we tell our people that the one way you can test everything, like be Bereans, is it doesn't smell like Jesus, what you're hearing from people. Do you think that could come out of Jesus's mouth? Do you feel like that would be something he would do or say? And I'm concerned that our young men just don't know Jesus enough to say that that's not him. They think he's a political leader. They think he is all about them getting ahead. And so how do we make the truth? That's the craziness. How do we make the truth more appealing so that they'll tap into it more? Or don't we?
So I don't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. For whatever reason, I almost didn't hear, heard almost none of what you just said.
Well, it
So
probably wasn't good. So
I
that's
don't know what's
okay.
going on. Oh, now you're coming in. It's coming in and out. So I'm losing. Yeah. I think one of the, and I don't know what you said. So we'll see if this works together. But I think what I caught a little bit was this aspect of not only vulnerability, but how are we balancing against or battling against these voices that are so strong and are hitting so much. And again, I think I feel that all the time, and I feel that with this aspect of being a lone voice out here, even with people close to me, that is being squashed by the cacophony of voices that are just coming at them all the time. And I think similar to like what I said with my boys is that, okay, I'm just gonna keep trying to be faithful. I'm gonna keep trying to point the people to Jesus and who he was, and show that he did far less turning over tables and far more loving the people in front of them and loving in front of him, with care and compassion and gentleness. And I'm going to just keep. I'm going to try to keep banging that drum over and over and over. And it's in looking at this, I came across and was reminded of 1 Corinthians 16, where it says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong, let all you do be done in love." And it's interesting. You've got these, I'm sure what some people champion would be like, act like men, be strong, blah, blah, blah. And then they forget verse 14, let all that you do be done in love. And so I'm trying to continue to pound that drum, even though it feels like a tiny little microphone with all these bullhorns all around me. But that's where I'm coming alongside young men that are deacons or on staff or are in the church, as well as the older generation, guys my age and a little older, where I'm trying to pour into them and say, go after these guys, and trying to model for them, okay, this is what this looks like. And this is what we're encouraging guys. And I've got hunters, and I've got farmers, and I've got accountants, and I've got like just a variety of different insurance and DNR and like all these different things. And knives, guns, like all the stuff that you would think of, and yet trying to, okay, what are we about? And let's get into the word and try and let that word shape us and do what it means to be done all in love. So that's, don't know if that balances what you were saying before, but there's a couple things.
Yeah. And I'll follow on to that, but Matt, do you have something?
No, yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think there feels like a danger in trying to, I mean, in one sense, compete with the compete on the marketplace of loud voices. Because I think, you know, the still small voice of the Lord is maybe not meant to rise above that that conversation. It's meant to be heard in the secret place. So
Mm.
I think, I think like trying to, and even in terms of the idea of fruit or result, like if you try to make fruit apart from the process that creates good fruit, you just end up with like a wax apple or something, right? And so like I think there has to be this much like, I don't know, longer term, bigger picture, not the size of a reel, not the size of a social media post, like engagement. I don't even mean conversation, but like engagement with someone, um, and there has to be an aspect of someone having gone ahead of you, right? Like, I think some things can go hand in hand where you walk with someone. I think some things have to be like, I have gone before you and will show you the way. But like, I think that is that's like an inner life cultivation thing. It's not I'm not sure it's entirely intellectual. Um, and so, yeah, I think that what will be compelling about Jesus is not like his kind of snappy social media presence or something, right? It's going to be like an experience of him in the inner life that will be even hard for me to describe to you, right? Because like
Sure.
I don't, I'm not in your inner life, and I'm not wounded by my dad in the way that you are, and I'm not, all these different things. So we all have to kind of walk into the valley, um, and see if he meets us there and how he meets us there. Um, yeah.
So, what I think, in what you're saying, Matt, that it is in the inner place, it's that personal relationship with Jesus that becomes appealing. And we really have to rely on the Spirit to do work in the lives of these people. And so we pursue our own relationship um, with Him. And that's where there's fruitfulness for us. And then hopefully that goes over for them. And I think that is the encouragement we take is like as a church for us, we've just been through Zechariah 4 in that don't despise the day of small beginnings or small things, right? That the laying of the foundation of the temple, it was not nearly as glorious as it had been. It wasn't nearly what they had hoped it would be, but God was rejoicing in the start of the work. And so as we as men, as parents, as leaders, or even just friends in the church, encourage young men to see Christ and pursue Christ likeness, it may be small things that we start with, but we're not to despise those things because the Lord will rejoice because there's motion, there's activity, and I think he is glorified in it. He is pleased by it, and he will come alongside us, and it's not by our might, not by our strength, but by His Spirit that the work will be done. So on Christian masculinity, any last thoughts from each of you as we send our people back into the world and send this little podcast into the sea of noise that it will go into?
There was as I was doing a little bit of research, even this morning, I ran across an article from James Wood from World Magazine, an opinion that I think he just posted today. And in the article, he said, "Our task is not to coddle grievance, but to strengthen what is weak. Men who are disoriented and worn down need a constructive vision of masculinity that challenges both mainstream suspicion of manhood and the manosphere's cultivation of resentment. The church is uniquely positioned to offer this. It provides embodied community of mentoring and modeling." So, it was just one more article that's kind of backing up what you were just saying there of like, okay, here's the opportunity that that a podcast, that an influencer while they have influence, obviously they're an influencer, they don't have the community. They don't have the possibility of 24/7 life on life mentoring and modeling that we have. And that's it's the beauty of the church, of what Jesus has established, of us being able to be a part of something that puts flesh and bone on this aspect of growing to be more like Christ, that those guys don't. And so it's really leaning more and more into that reality.
That's good. Matt, any last thoughts?
Yeah, my thought is just kind of forming around the idea that I think our vocabulary of discipleship and spiritual formation, like I think it can be a lot bigger than maybe we are told it can be or accept that it can be. Um, and I think there's sort of a physical aspect of that, by which I mean this does not have the investment in men and in ourselves as men does not have to happen in sort of distinctly or exclusively Christian moments or spaces, um, like at church or at Bible study or at, hey, let's get a coffee and talk. Like I think the world, like all around us at work, at home, in I don't know, hard things, good things, creative things, destructive things, like the conversation about uh manhood in this moment and who I am in this moment, who you are in this moment, like that can happen anywhere. And it does not have to be necessarily a like, I don't know, a Christian conversation, right? It's like a
Mm-hmm.
conversation about creation groaning, right? In some sense. And I don't know, I think there's a sense in which I feel like wanting to release the pressure valve on like go out and feel a burden for this Christian task or this Christian ministry that needs to happen in the world, and more like go experience God deeply and see what happens. You know, I don't like there's like a call, I guess, of into more depth and into more personal reflection. And like I think that is kind of where the cultivation will begin, that people will start to interact with in a more interesting way. Like, and it won't be everybody, you know. I think it will be some, just like the Lord experienced. But uh, yeah, that's kind of I want to free the conversation from the ministry. Not it should be happening in ministry, but I think it should be happening like in every moment in some sense.
Yeah. Just in life. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's key. I think it is just that exhortation to go and just own the fullness of Christ for all of life for yourself, and then expose that truth to others as you go. And that will be for young men, for young women, for old men, older women, all those that are around you in the church, your neighbors, your enemies, even, as we're called to live and make disciples. So, guys, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation. It'll be a conversation we'll continue to have, and maybe we'll get you on to talk about some other things. But I thank you, and hope that you will have a blessed rest of your day.